Good morning, everybody. Dr. Vasquez here, coming to you live on the 16th of July, 2026. We're going to take a look at this article from the New England Journal of Medicine. This is titled Monoclonal Antibody to PACAP. I'll tell you what that means in just a moment, for migraine prevention. So basically, PACAP or PACAP is another inflammatory molecule kind of in the cascade of migraine. So they're targeting this molecule, inflammatory molecule, which is basically just like CGRP. This is basically doing the same thing they did with CGRP. So in 2018, I think a couple of drug companies came out miraculously at the same time. You'll notice that that's a trend. They came out at the same time with some new drugs targeting CGRP, which is calcitonin gene-related peptide, in migraine patients. And basically, this is an inflammatory mediator among many inflammatory mediators in the cascade of migraine. And so they targeted this one molecule with antibodies and then later other types of drugs, receptor blockers and things like that, to see if it would help people with migraine. It provided a little bit of benefit. So of course, the FDA, which is totally fucking worthless, approved it. And I'm not saying that their approval was inappropriate, because, you know, even if a drug is expensive and even if it doesn't work that great, it can still provide benefit to people. So I'm not necessarily trying to criticize the FDA in this case for approving that drug. It was probably a reasonable approval. But I think what I was trying to suggest subtly is that the FDA is just a garbage organization generally. So, you know, FDA approval really doesn't mean much. If you've ever lived or worked or studied in academic medicine, those dumbasses think that FDA approval is everything, right? So a drug gets FDA approved, and all of the people, like in a medical school, they'll just literally just get on their knees and praise whatever the new drug is, because they've resigned their brains to the FDA. And so the FDA will approve whatever, a new drug, a new vaccine, a new whatever, and people in academic medicine will just say, yeah, it's the best thing that ever happened in the last 6 minutes. So anyway, I am frustrated greatly by the FDA, but also by people's stupidity of just going along with whatever the FDA says is okay, you know? FDA approval doesn't mean anything. A lot of times it doesn't mean safety, it doesn't mean efficacy, it doesn't mean cost effectiveness. Sometimes it doesn't mean anything at all, like when the FDA approved certain drugs for the pandemic, the worst of which was molnupiravir. I mean, molnupiravir was garbage. It hadn't been approved for anything. And then all of a sudden, it got approval for the pandemic. Why? Because they needed a market for a bad drug. I think it was produced by Merck, possibly Pfizer, but I think it was Merck. And, you know, they spent millions of dollars on this drug. And so, you know, they cozied up with their buddies at the FDA and they said, hey, approve our drug for COVID. We got no use for it otherwise, and we wasted, you know, a couple $1,000,000. And so the FDA said, yeah, we'll approve it for COVID. It's just utterly ridiculous. So, again, I've already started kind of overlapping a few different topics. Topic number one, the main priority is looking at this new research article as an exercise. And maybe it has value. I'm not trying to foreshadow that it either does or doesn't have value, but we're going to look at it. So we're going to look at this article. I also mentioned that this paradigm is practically identical to the CGRP paradigm, which is blocking an inflammatory mediator to see if that helps people with migraine headaches. Again, as I already mentioned, the history of that goes back only a few years, because in 2018, that's when the new drugs came out targeting CGRP, which is very similar to this. And the drugs weren't very good. The FDA, of course, approved them. And I think the FDA is a garbage organization, but the approval was reasonable. Yeah, they help some people. And so that has whatever value it has. They're also very expensive. They're about $7,000 a year. $7,000 a year for those new CGRP drugs when they first came out. Now, some of them, especially the oral meds, because originally they were all by injection, just like this one. Now they're $1,500 a month is the cash price. So, and that's only for partial benefit in some people. So, again, when the drugs first came out in 2018, the anti-CGRP drugs for migraine, they were $7,000 a year. And they only helped 1 out of 6 or 7 people. So that means you had to treat 6 people to get 1 person better, which means at $7,000 a year, you're spending $42,000 to help 1 person get a little bit better. And so if you wonder why healthcare is so expensive in the United States, that's a really good example, among many examples. So anyway, that's just kind of the background and context. I also mentioned that FDA approval is absolutely meaningless. It doesn't mean safety, it barely means effectiveness, it doesn't mean cost effectiveness, and it doesn't mean at all comparable effectiveness. So again, those are some concepts and vocabulary that you might want to, keep in your pocket for whatever interesting conversations you're going to have. So right now we're going to converse about this article. So again, I think this is a good exercise. I went through this article once last week very quickly. I haven't even highlighted it, so I'll do that right now. And I want you to think about reading this at least at 3 different levels. So let's say that, first of all, obviously this is a, scientific or medical article. So some people would have a hard time reading this, even if they can read other things. They would have a hard time reading this just because it's a lot of vocabulary that they're not accustomed to. So, the most basic skill of reading is just decoding. You can look at the words and you can understand most of the words, or at least you think you understand most of the words. Reading is, a lot like other skills. A lot of people think they're good at it until they have a comparative reference, and then they say, oh, well, I thought I was good, but I'm not as good as I could be. And so, like basic reading would allow you to kind of go through this, and maybe a person would understand some things, but even they would know at level 1, let's say, that they don't understand everything. And then level 2, we could say maybe somebody has more vocabulary, so they would have an easier time reading this. So, step 1 is just decoding the words. Step 2, maybe somebody who has like a bachelor's degree in biology, like I do, or a bachelor's degree in neuroscience or something, they would have an easier time reading an article like this. But they still wouldn't be able to, go all the way with it, so to speak. So the third level of reading this would be critical reading of it. Like, they're saying XYZ, but does XYZ even make sense? So, we have basic reading, we have kind of more fluent reading would be maybe step number 2. Step number 3 would be critical reading. It's like, okay, you're reading it, you understand the words, you understand the vocabulary, but you're reading it from the perspective of not just accepting what you're reading, you're actually trying to criticize your own internal dialogue as you go through it. So let's just call that level 3. And then level 4 would be, beyond critical reading is comparative reading. So you could read this, but in the background, of your mind, you have other information to contextualize this. So you can contextualize this, you can compare this with other things that you've read, and that would even be, let's say a higher level of analysis or exercise with an article like this. So, like I said, I did go through this article last week really quickly. And we're going to go through it right now. I'm going to highlight it, which means it's going to screw up the screen just a little bit. But not too bad. Let's get this over. Back where it was. Oops. Okay. So I'm going to highlight this and just kind of show you what I look at when I'm reading an article like this. I'll post the full text of the article, and I encourage you to take at least a quick look at it before you access the critique that I'm doing right now, because like I said, you know, anybody can read an article like this at whatever level they read it, and they can say, oh yeah, well, the New England Journal of Medicine said this. And sometimes they'll accept it at face value for what it says. But again, that would be reading at like level 1 or level 2, which is barely reading it or fluently reading it, but not critically reading it or contextually reading it as you go through it. So, you know, the New England Journal of Medicine, okay, so before I get into additional commentary, if you want to do the exercise of kind of exposing yourself to this work without my critique, and then you can compare how you read it compared to how I read it, I want you to do that now, so you could pause the video and take a quick look at this. I'm going to start getting into it. I'm going to start getting into it right now. First thing, the first context I'm going to provide is the fact that this is obviously the New England Journal of Medicine, and they're basically a drug tabloid that appears to function like a medical journal. So New England Journal of Medicine is, for me, is just junk, but I still read it, and I still read articles like this because embedded somewhere in that junk is going to be some level of science. And, you know, even if I want to do mostly my nutrition protocol, as you can see for migraine, if I want to do mostly nutrition for migraine, you know, as a prescribing doc, maybe I still want to use some drugs every once in a while. Or maybe I want to understand the disease from a drug perspective, just so I gain more insight into the disease. And that's basically what I get. That's basically what I get, or what I got out of this article. So again, this is going to be a new class of drugs targeting a new target for the drug industry anyway. A new target called PACAP, I think is what I said earlier before, PACAP, pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide. So again, in the cascade of migraine dysfunction and pain, it happens to be this molecule. And so they're targeting this with some antibodies to see if they can get rid of it and see if that provides any benefit. This is a phase 2 trial. So this is also something I wanted to comment on. This is a phase 2 trial. So phase 1 is just basic safety. Phase 2 is they're starting to look at, well, okay, we know it's safe. Now we want to know what's the appropriate dose, and is it effective at all? Like minimally effective against placebo. Now, stage 3 is a comparative study against whatever the current standard is. You barely ever see those types of studies. Why? Because the drug industry doesn't want to compete against itself. They want to compete against this imaginary placebo stupidity, because that's the only way they can usually show any benefit. If you were to compare most drugs against other drugs or even against nutrients, they would fail. They would fall flat on their face. So most medical research only goes to phase 2. Again, phase 1 is basic safety and maybe a little bit of dose finding. Stage 2, or phase 2, is just looking at efficacy, usually against a stupid placebo. Sometimes they pick a fake placebo to make their drug look better, like they did with the fish oil studies. Again, stage 3 is comparative, and you barely ever see those. They don't want to do those studies because they don't want to compete against themselves. The drug industry, even though they might be different businesses like Merck and Pfizer and whatever else, even though they're different industry in different businesses, or different corporations, they all really work together, and they don't want to compete against each other. They're actually pretty friendly with each other. So again, this is probably as good as it's going to get. Stage 4 is post-marketing surveillance. They also don't want to do that because that's when you start to see adverse effects or negative efficacy like we do with the vaccines. So, even though in medical research we talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, they really only want to do phase 1, which basically shows safety, and phase 2, which shows that it's better than nothing. Even if it's barely better than nothing. And then they don't want to do 3 because they don't want to compete against each other because they're all buddies in the drug industry. And then they sure as hell don't want to do stage 4, phase 4, because that would be showing long-term adverse effects and lack of efficacy in the long term. So they don't want to show that. They want to do these initial studies in drug-naive patients who haven't been drugged with other drugs, and certainly not with these drugs, because that's their only chance of showing any minimal benefit. And you'll see this play out in this article. So let's assume that you already read this article, like I suggested. You would understand what I'm talking about when I say that these drugs are only going to work in drug-naive patients, and they're not going to work for prolonged periods of time. Why is that? Because these are antibodies, and they are by definition exogenous antibodies, which means they were created outside of the human body. When they get injected into the body, they're going to be perceived as foreign antibodies or foreign proteins. And so the human body is going to make antibodies against these drug antibodies. And as you would expect, that's going to neutralize the drug, which it's basically just antibodies. And then the drug's not going to work after time, right? So that's why they're doing this specifically. I mean, obviously this is a new drug, but they're also doing this in drug-naive patients because they know it's only going to work for a limited period of time. After these patients are exposed to the drug a few times, or even after the first time, after they are exposed to the drug, their body is going to produce antibodies against this drug, and the drug's going to quit working. So they have to publish these one-time studies in order to have any chance whatsoever of making the drug look good, so they can get it approved and then sell it. So, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, whatever. Participants were randomly assigned to receive a single-dose baseline infusion of this antibody, either at 750 milligrams, 100 milligrams, or nothing. Placebo. We'll see what their placebo was. Hopefully it's just water. But sometimes it's not. So they're still doing a little bit of dose finding here. Like I said, phase 1 studies are mostly for safety, but they can also include dose finding. Like maybe it's safe at 100 milligrams, but it's not safe at 750 milligrams. That's kind of phase 1, sometimes phase 2. So they're doing that here. They're doing a little bit of dose finding, even though this should be more for efficacy. They're going to look at baseline and number of migraine days per month. I guess I'll go ahead and read the entire abstract because I'm not going to read the rest of the article right now in its entirety. I'll just show you what I remember as being of interest. So they had 237 participants. That's pretty good. Baseline, mean change. So they show different data later as far as I remember. So this is kind of weird. But let's just look at it at face value. Mean number of baseline migraine days per month was 16.7 in the overall population. So what does that tell you diagnostically about these migraine patients? Remember, I've already written about migraine now for 25 years. I got the whole protocol in the book. So if you're seriously interested, you can get the book. It has the whole protocol, including all my famous diagrams. That's a pretty basic diagram, even though it's really important. But I do have some better diagrams, I think. I know they're in here somewhere. Oh, it's not so important. All right, well now I have to show you the diagrams because I talked about them. And I told you how good they were, even though I wasn't able to spot one just in that second, but it should be right here in the first couple of pages. Yeah, here it is, third page. So, you know, we've got mitochondria, we've got microglia cells, we've got astrocytes, we've got neurons, and all that contributes to brain inflammation and mitochondrial insufficiency, we might say. So that's my model for migraine. While all of that's happening in the background, yeah, you have some inflammatory mediators flying around and you can intercept those kind of like a football and see if you get some benefit. So anyway, like I started to say, migraine days per month was more than 16. So what does that classifies these people as chronic migraine. This isn't episodic migraine. These people are living with migraine most of their lives. Even though it's only like 55%, it's still most of their lives. So again, the mean change from baseline, they only did this for 1 month. Remember, this is a one-time deal over 1 month because they know the drug's not going to work after that. So they don't want to look at that. They reduced 6.2 days in the high-dose group and 4.2 days in the placebo group. Sorry, where's the 100? At this point, they didn't report the 100 milligram group. That's kind of weird. Adverse effects with a higher, look at this. Adverse events with a higher incidence in the 750 group were coronavirus and nasopharyngitis. Double the risk of coronavirus and nasopharyngitis. So again, this is a humanized, I believe they described it as a humanized antibody, monoclonal antibody against this inflammatory mediator. So what's happening? Probably that antibody is interfering with other inflammatory pathways that actually support immune function, or it could be that this antibody is, you know, directly binding onto something like an off-target effect, like secretory IgA maybe, I don't know, it's just a guess, or another cytokine or something like that. So something is happening here to provide what's called an off-target effect. So they're trying to just target this PACAP, pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide. They're trying to target that, but either that molecule has other beneficial effects that they're neutralizing with this drug, or their drug is neutralizing something that they're not even aware of. So something's happening here, but these people are getting sick, even though they showed a slight benefit against their migraine. They got coronavirus at twice the rate and also nasopharyngitis. Well, you know, a couple years ago, coronavirus was considered, you know, the plague of humanity. But now they're going to say it's okay. Oh, it's just a little bit of coronavirus. Oh, yeah, but you shut down the entire planet, you know, a couple years ago for that same coronavirus, which now you're saying, oh, it's just a little side effect. Nobody cares. So that's how the medical world works. Yesterday's Holocaust is today's adverse effect. That doesn't matter. So, as you would expect in the New England Journal of Medicine, a single intravenous infusion of 750 milligrams of this new drug showed superiority over placebo in reducing migraine frequency over the subsequent 4 weeks. Remember, this is a hot hit. They had to get in, treat these patients. These patients are going to start creating antibodies against the antibody that they're getting as the drug, and so it's going to quit working. So that's why they had to do this really quick, 4 weeks. But I want to introduce a term that very few of you are familiar with, because this is really important, what I'm about to say. And this will help you understand the fraud that's being committed. I mean, you're looking at fraud right here. Whether you know it or not, you're basically looking at fraud. but I'm about to explain to you the fraud. So the way this fraud works is they're providing you an absolute conclusion or result. They're not even contextualizing it within the context of their own article. So that's the concept that I want you to have. Now I'm going to explain it to you really easily so you'll understand what the hell I'm talking about. So what you want to look at when you're looking at research, and again, this is like nobody talks about this, and nobody talks about this because well, I'm about to talk about it. But the reason that this basic concept isn't more well known is because the medical system depends on your ignorance of basic analysis. So what I'm about to tell you right now, I've only seen this mentioned like literally once or twice. I've only seen this mentioned once or twice among the tens of thousands of articles that I've read. But somewhere in the tens of thousands of articles that I've read, I did see this concept. And I'm about to apply that concept here, and you're going to see the value of it. So let me get out my underline here. So what they want you to focus on is the fact that they got a reduction of 6.2 days with their new drug. Remember now, they started at 16. Usually, see, you would have to know, like, what's the context? What's the criteria for success in the treatment of migraine headaches? The criteria for success usually is a 50% reduction. Did they achieve a 50% reduction with their drug so that we can then declare that this drug was actually worthwhile? No, they did not. So half of 16 would be 8. They achieved a reduction of 6. That's not 8. So that's not so great. But the language they're going to use, because they're trying to please the FDA, they want to show superiority over placebo. What was the placebo effect? The placebo effect was 4.2. So the people who got whatever their nothing was, their placebo, the people who got nothing had a reduction of 4.2 compared to 6.2 for the people who got the drug. So according to that dry data, the drug was more effective than placebo, but only by 33%. Or 50%, depending on how you want to look at it. But let's say, call it 40%, call it whatever. Is that grossly superior over placebo? It's a little better than placebo. I don't know if I would call it better than placebo. I don't know if I would call it superior. I mean, superior is kind of like kicking butt. This is not kicking butt by any measure whatsoever, right? But here's where it gets worse. And here's the concept that like I said, I have read tens of thousands of articles. And this concept that I'm about to tell you, I've only seen it mentioned like once or twice in all of the articles I've ever read. And worse than that is when I was in my last year of medical school, I did a pre-doctoral research fellowship with the NIH to study research methodology. And they didn't even talk about this. They didn't talk about much of anything. It was basically just like a dog and pony show. It was pretty pathetic. But it sounds cool. I get to say I did a pre-doctoral research fellowship at the NIH, and I thought it sucked. Anyway, here's what you want to know. You want to know how to do very basic math, which is called a placebo-subtracted difference. Shazam! If you can reasonably assume that the placebo effect that was measured in the placebo group also applies to the drugged group. That's the whole purpose of looking for a placebo effect. But they never want to take it to the next step. They never want to talk about what I'm about to say again, which is you look at the placebo-subtracted difference. if you look at the placebo subtracted difference going from negative 6.2 subtracting the negative 4.2, you get a difference of 2 days. So they did all of this to get a 2-day difference in patients who are having migraine at least 16 days out of the month. So out of 16 days, they got a benefit of 2 days. That is barely of any clinical significance whatsoever. That's barely, like even a patient's, they're going to say, yeah, thanks for the extra 2 days, but that's still not much. So again, they want to be able to say what they said here, which is superiority over placebo, because that's all the FDA is going to care about. Did you kill anybody? Whether you did or not, was it better than placebo? Okay, you're approved. So this is just science. I'm sure they talk about CGRP, yeah. So here's the CGRP drugs that I mentioned before. This is basically doing the same thing as the CGRP drugs, just targeting a different molecule. Blah, blah. So let's look at a little more detail here. Procedures, participants, whatever. I don't really care that much. I do want to go back and talk about the anti-drug antibodies that were formed in these people. All of this is just fluff, in my opinion. So here we go to the results. So at baseline, mean number of headache days per month was 17.4. Not every one of those headaches is going to qualify as a migraine. So they had 17 days of headache, but most of those were migraine for sure. So you'll notice that sometimes, and look, it happens here. You'll notice that sometimes what they say in the abstract is different from what they say in the text. So look at it here. The mean change from baseline in the number of headache days per month was 5.8 in the high dose group. Well, you could reasonably wonder, why are they saying 5.8 here when they said 6.2 here? Not a huge difference, but it is a difference. Why are they saying 6.2 in the part that's going to get the most press? And then, oh yeah, in the text they say, oh, well, it wasn't really 6.2. It was only 5.8. And negative 4.1, I think the other one was 4.2, they said, in the placebo group. So that's basically the same. But they could have been talking about headache, and they probably were, talking about headache versus migraine. So slight difference there, but patients don't really care. I mean, if a patient has 16 or 17 days of headache per month, and out of those 17, 16 of those qualify as migraine, and one of them didn't qualify as migraine, they're still pretty miserable. So clinically, the difference doesn't matter. Here we go again. Reduction of 4.4 in the high dose group and 3 in the placebo group. So the difference is only a day and a half. It's not even 2 days. Remember, you have to look at the placebo subtracted benefit or the placebo subtracted difference. If your drug works to a 6-day benefit, let's call it, so the people get the drug, they get a benefit of 6 days fewer per month of headache. Okay, that sounds kind of cool. But if the placebo people had a reduction of 4, then you're only looking at a difference of 2. So when you look at research, you have to look at the placebo subtracted benefit. And in this case, it's only 2 days or less than 2 days per month. So that would be like 1.6, but these people were at 16 baseline. So you're looking at a 10% benefit. the traditional standard in pain management is either a 30% reduction up to a 50% reduction. They're nowhere near that. They're barely getting 10% out of this. So, common adverse events were coronavirus, nasopharyngitis, and fatigue. Well, look, this was a study only done for 1 month. So, more than double the rate of coronavirus and sinus infection to benefit a day and a half, maybe 2 days with the drug in terms of less headache or less migraine. So that people look at, this is what I call disease exchange. And this is really common in drug therapy. You're just trading one disease for another. Okay, so the benefit is remember, this is only 1 month, so this is pretty acute data. The benefit they provided is at most 2 days less of migraine or headache. But they had more nasopharyngitis, fatigue, and coronavirus. Coronavirus usually lasts for 2 weeks for most people. In my case, it only lasted 24 hours. But even my wife had it for a week. So you're benefiting these people 2 fewer days of headache, but they're getting fatigue, sinus infection, and coronavirus, which can last at least a week. And that's not a good trade-off. So here we go. Remember I said, and you would know this like if you studied like physiology and pathophysiology and medicine and stuff like that. If you inject a foreign protein into the human body, you would expect that the body's going to produce antibodies against whatever that foreign protein is. And here we are. The overall incidence of the development of anti-drug antibodies was 11%. But 9%. Yeah, 12% with higher dose and 9% with the lower dose. You would expect that. But that's only in the first month. That's only 1 month. By the time these people have been treated for 6 months, what percentage of these people are going to be creating these neutralizing antibodies? The other thing is, remember what I've said before about immune complex disease. So antibodies don't just, I'm trying to look for a model or something. I guess I'll use 2 models. So let's assume that this is a protein and this is an antibody, which also happens to be a protein. Anytime your body attacks a foreign protein, which could be a virus, a bacteria, or a drug, attacks it with an antibody, this can create a long chain of antigens, antibodies. That's called an immune complex. When that happens, those immune complexes can get deposited into tissues like the lungs or the kidneys or the skin or the blood vessels, and that's called vasculitis or pneumonitis or serositis or nephritis. But my point is, this is not a benign finding. When you find that people are creating antibodies against the drug, and you're talking about trying to give these people the same drug for years at a time, some of those people are going to potentially, this is what they have to look out for, some of those people are going to potentially create these antibody complexes, which are called immune complexes, and that can be a problem. But remember, this is 11% or 12% only in 1 month. So imagine taking this drug for 6 months. Imagine taking this drug for 6 months. If they found 11% of anti-drug antibodies in the first month, and then also in the first month, they had a doubled incidence of coronavirus and a doubled incidence of sinus infections, I wouldn't take this drug for 6 months. And I don't know if they've elsewhere. I think the drug is still being studied. I don't think it's been approved anywhere yet. Maybe it has been. This was published in 2024, so 2 years ago. But like I said, when the very similar CGRP drugs came out, They were $7,000 a month. Imagine paying $7,000 a year. Imagine paying $7,000 for a drug like this that only provides a day and a half or 2 days of benefit, of legitimate benefit, but doubles the risk for coronavirus and sinus infections. I mean, that's a disaster. So here they just talk about theory and why they did this and how great it is. So here's the conclusion. Superiority over placebo. But how superior was it? It was only